Catherine Veitch was my oldest friend in Australia, both in the sense that she was my first chum there, and also that she was just about old enough to be my mother. I met her at the Melbourne Writers' Festival in 1992. I can't remember the circumstances now, other than that she approached me after a reading, either to set me straight with regard to some mistake I had made in one of my books on language — she was of a scholarly bent and impatient with sloppiness — or to enlighten me concerning some aspect of Australian life on which I had imprudently commented in the question-and-answer session. The upshot is that we had a cup of tea in the cafeteria, and that the next day I took a tram to her house in St. Kilda for lunch, where I met most of her family. Her children, of whom she seemed to have a large but indeterminate number, were all grown and living away, but most of them called in at various points in the afternoon, to borrow a tool or check for messages, or to burrow in the fridge. It was just the kind of household I had always longed to grow up in. Happy, comfortable, nicely chaotic, full of shouted conversations of the "try looking in the cupboard at the top of the stairs" type. And I liked Catherine very much. She was kind and funny and thoughtful and direct. So we became great friends, though it was a friendship based almost entirely on correspondence. She had never been to America, and I went to Australia once a year if I was lucky, and not always to Melbourne. But 3 or 4 times a year she would send me long, wonderfully discursive letters hammered out on a jumpy and willful typewriter. These letters seldom took less than an hour to read. In a single page they could range over a galaxy of subjects: her childhood in Adelaide, the inadequacies of certain politicians, actually of most politicians, why Australians lack confidence, what her children had been up to. Generally she stuck in a wadding of cuttings from The Age, the Melbourne newspaper. Much of what I know about Australia I learned from her. I loved those letters. They came from so far away. Just getting an envelope from Australia still seemed to me a faintly wondrous event, and described events and experiences that were unexceptional to her, but breathtakingly exotic to me. Taking a tram into the city, suffering through a heat wave in December, attending a lecture at the Royal Melbourne Institute, shopping for curtains at David Jones, the big local department store. I can't explain it except to say that, without giving up any part of the life I had already, I wanted intensely to have all that in my life as well. So it was through her letters, more than from almost anything else, that I consolidated my fixation with Australia. Her letters were always happy, but the last one I received from her was especially sunny. She and John, her husband, were about to sell the house in St. Kilda and move to the Mornington Peninsula, south of Melbourne, to take up a life of gracious retirement beside the sea, fulfilling a dream of very long standing. Just after she sent that letter, to the shock of everyone who knew her, she suffered a sudden heart attack and died. I'd have been on my way to visit her now. Instead, all I can offer is my favorite of the many stories she told me. In the 1950s, a friend of Catherine's moved with her young family into a house next door to a vacant lot. One day, a construction crew turned up to build a house on the lot. Catherine's friend had a 3-year-old daughter who naturally took an interest in all the activity going on next door. She hung around on the margins, and eventually the construction workers adopted her as a kind of mascot. They chatted to her and gave her little jobs to do, and at the end of the week presented her with a little pay packet containing a shiny new half-crown. She took this home to her mother, who made all the appropriate cooings of admiration, and suggested that they take it to the bank the next morning to deposit it in her account. When they went to the bank, the cashier was equally impressed and asked the little girl how she'd come by her own pay packet. "I've been building a house this week," she replied proudly. "Goodness," said the teller. "And will you be building a house next week, too?" "I will if we ever get the fucking bricks," answered the little girl.